Welcome, everyone. Thank you, John, for that rundown. We are back with our weekly Zoom call. It's so exciting to see familiar names and new names in the list, and welcome if it's your first time. We want this to be a place where we can share resources, where we can offer questions and answers and suggestions, and we're excited to focus on employment today, but employment in the context of reopening the state. So we know that Governor Ducey lifted the stay-at-home order this week, and that means some people are planning on returning to the workplace. Some people are continuing to do what they have been doing for weeks. Others are planning on returning to day programs, and then still others are out of work. So we're excited to invite the CEO of the Arizona Center for Disability Law, JJ Rico, to speak today. And he's going to talk about a lot of the issues people are facing. And we want this to be a time where you're interacting in the chat. Remember, *9 to raise your hand on the phone. And we are going to go ahead and get started. Now, please keep in mind, as usual, we have a time at the second half of the call where we're going to open it up for broader issues related to COVID-19 and the pandemic. We want to hear what you're facing. We're actually going to start things off a little different today and start off with a poll. So Jeff, if you want to bring the poll up for people to take, we want to do a pulse check. How comfortable are you around this idea of reopening Arizona this week? Take a few moments. There's only 2 questions. Indicate how you're feeling about things. We actually have a longer survey we're going to talk about later on in the call that we will be sending out to our entire network, but we'll start off with this small poll, and we'll take a few moments for you all to share how you're feeling. A lot of mixed feelings out there for sure. We have about 110 people on the call today, and we already are seeing a lot of yeses to the question, do you expect your employer to provide accommodations related to COVID-19 for your workplace? Now that's up to 86%. 2% of folks are saying no, they don't expect that. 11% are unsure. And our second question, how anxious are you about Arizona reopening as an employer or as an employee? We have more of a spread with this one. 44% are very anxious. 40% or so are feeling somewhat anxious. And then 6% are not feeling anxious, but they're not feeling calm either, just more of a neutral feeling. Wow, it's really interesting to see those numbers. So without further ado, JJ, with that context in mind about how our audience is feeling this morning about reopening, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Happy Blur's Day, or whatever today is. If you have that on your calendar, is it April, May? I've lost track. But I'm excited to see so many people here today. It's nice to actually see people on the screen besides my kids running around the house. And one of the things that survey highlights to me is that the majority of the participants are anxious. If you add the 2 numbers together, you're looking at 82% of you feel some anxiety about the reopening of Arizona and your employer, whether you're an employer or an employee. And I think that's common. And so hopefully some of my training will help alleviate some of that anxiety, give you some tools to navigate with your employer. If you are an employer, it'll give you some advice and some direction of where to look to get that direction, which is out there now, especially on the Eeoc website and the Job Accommodation Network. But what I'm excited to see from the poll is, number one, 87% of you expect your employer to provide accommodations, and I was not expecting such a high number. So that gives me some positivity as we move forward through the presentation. I have to go quickly, and when you ask a lawyer to be short and concise, that's a difficult thing to do. So I have about 30 minutes with you to highlight some new laws, to highlight existing laws, and then to refer you to some more guidance that can kind of take you beyond the 30-40-minute discussion that I have with you. So, and feel free to ask any questions during this time, and I'll try to answer them as concisely as I can, so that everyone else can have an opportunity as well. So why don't we jump in? There are a few recent laws, and before I start, if my partners can help me, if someone has a question, please alert me to that, as I'm going to be looking at some materials, and I might not be able to see a hand raise or a comment in the chat box. So if you could help me there, I'd appreciate that. So let's jump in, everyone. So one of the things that is new is Congress acted immediately, very quickly. Normally laws don't pass very fast, and especially employment laws or extensions of leave laws, but Congress passed two laws that are very important to this time, one being the Family First Coronavirus Response Act, and the second being the Emergency Family and Medical Leave Expansion Act. And so I'm going to give you a quick synopsis of what each of those laws are. We at the Arizona Center for Disability Law just published 2 blog posts related to each of these with links to the Department of Labor that will explain them in more detail. So again, if I didn't answer a question, feel free to please reference our materials. Again, it's available on our website. And then I know that Natalie, our outreach manager, is probably going to post those in the chat room and then email those out afterwards. So you have all the references that I'm talking about today. So for the Family First, if we go there and look at that material, if I can get there, I'll just allow technology to take place. The Family First, if we get there, just a second. Just give me one moment while technology works or doesn't. It's not working, but that's okay. Let's talk about the Emergency FMLA Act first, why that one pulls up. And I apologize for the knocking in the background. I have a 13-year-old child who wants to be part of every of Daddy's presentations, and this one I've locked him out of, so please bear with me. So the Family First Coronavirus Response Act has to do with qualified employers to provide paid leave to employees if that employee is unable to work or telework under qualifying circumstances. Unable means the employer has work for the employee, so obviously there's still work going on, but the employee, so you as an employee, are unable to go to work because of qualifying circumstances. And so this applies to those with 500 or less employees, public employers, local governments this applies to. There are some exceptions to this new law. Healthcare providers, and the Department of Labor has broadly defined healthcare providers to include caregivers and nursing home employees, and also does not apply to first responders. So if you're in those categories of employees, this law does not apply in your situation. So what are some of the qualifying reasons to get the paid sick leave? Essentially, this is a paid sick leave, is you have to be subject to quarantine under federal, state, or local quarantine. You also have to have been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine. You have to be experiencing symptoms of COVID-19 and seeking a medical diagnosis. This also does apply if you're caring for an individual who's also been quarantined or in isolation under order for COVID-19, and also for if you're caring for a child whose school, which is closed, which this was written prior to school closures in Arizona, and so this would apply as well, plus places of care. I did see recently in a newspaper article that some daycare centers are reopening. So depending on the nature of that reopen, that may or may not apply. And then there's a whole calculation on the pay that you may receive if this law applies to you. So I would just say, again, I'm not going to spend all day on this, but if you want more information, visit our website, or the Department of Labor breaks this down in even more detail. So the Emergency Family Medical Leave Act, many of you may be familiar with FMLA. This extends extends FMLA to those situations where you have to care for a loved one, specifically for a child, or a closure related closure of school, closure of daycare. So again, it extends FMLA leave. If you've already exhausted your FMLA leave during the year, this is not on top of this. This is 12 weeks. period, but you do get a couple weeks of paid leave, insurance. So it's really important, if this does apply to you, to look into this in more detail and make that request of your employer. There are some limitations, again, on size of employers. So if you work for a small employer, there are some limitations there. So again, if you work for a larger employer or governmental agency, this most definitely applies. If you work for a school district, this applies. So those are the two new laws, and it's really to help with the impact that this COVID-19 has had in terms of folks becoming sick or quarantined, and then also the impact on closure, specifically to schools and daycare centers. So if those factors apply to you and that's impacting your ability to stay employed or maintain employment, please look at those and please bring those up with your employer. First self-advocacy tip of the day is to communicate effectively with your employer if you're currently employed or you're seeking employment. Document everything in writing, follow up in an email. It's the best way so we don't lose track of days. And I mean, I said the joke in the beginning, but literally I have been losing track of days. I know other folks, we ask what day is it anymore? What time is it? We're working at different hours. So again, if you keep a nice log of your contacts with your employer, or if you are an employer, contacts with your employees, so you all have a good record of what's been requested, when it was requested. When you want a response back, always give a due date of when you expect to receive a response and then follow up. So FMLA itself hasn't changed. So one of my tips is to utilize Family Medical Leave Act if you have a serious health condition, or if you have a spouse or child with a serious health condition. The nice thing about the Family Medical Leave Act is that it does ensure job protection. So one of the things that may lead to anxiety is will I have a job if I take leave? And FMLA does ensure that you have a position following your return from leave. So again, that's something, a great tool that's been in existence for a long time. If you're not aware, if your employer offers FMLA leave, please look into your personnel manual. If you have an HR department, call them, talk to your supervisor and talk about FMLA or Family Medical Leave Act and see if they currently are offering that. Some employers like the ACDL provide it regardless if you meet the requisite size of 50 or more employees. So it's always a good question to ask and to see if that's in as a benefit that your employer may have.
JJ, a quick question about the
Yes.
Emergency Medical Leave Act. Tiffany asked in the chat if one of the requirements is that you have to work for your employer for an entire year.
Correct. Yeah, that is true. So that's a good question, and that didn't change from FMLA. There's a requisite number of hours or time that you've worked for your employer. So you are right that there is a period of time. You have to be a full-time or part-time who worked for a covered employer, and the employee has to have been. Sorry, I'm going to stand corrected. I'm talking about FMLA there for a second. But in the emergency, if the employee has been an employee for at least 30 days. So for the emergency FMLA leave, it's at least 30 days. So I stand corrected there. I was going off of my FMLA knowledge. Any other questions?
Another question about FMLA and legal guardianship. So the question is from Sharon. If you are your sibling's legal guardian, does FMLA protect you?
If you are caring for your ward, is what I'm assuming the question. And so I would say yes, because it does apply to the care of a family member and with a serious health condition. So you would have to establish that your ward, who you're a guardian for, has a qualifying serious health condition, and then submit that paperwork. And that paperwork can be found on Department of Labor's website. It's pretty straightforward. The challenge right now for some of us who are trying to get to doctors there's a delay in appointments, and then the access to appointments are limited to these telemed appointments. So what I would urge is, if that's something you're considering doing, to get in as quickly as possible and virtually ask for an email, ask them for maybe just to answer the questions within an email that are in the form, and then attach the form. I'm hoping, and I know EEOC and their guidance is recommending some flexibility from employers when receiving some of these requests, including requests for emergency leave or family medical leave.
And then Carmen just was confirming that it's greater than 500 employees. Is that the qualifying condition for these laws? I know you mentioned some employers might change that themselves.
Right. So private sector employees with fewer than 500, this applies to fewer than 500. And then for federal employees, there are additional restrictions. So it's fewer than 500 that this applies to for the emergency family medical leave.
That's it from the chat. I'll keep jumping in when I can if I see more things pop up, JJ.
Great, I really appreciate that. Well, thank you for the questions and keep them coming. I most definitely want to make sure that this training is relevant to those in the audience out there, but I am going to now move into laws that have not changed, but specific COVID related questions and how to apply that law. And so the big law that we're going to talk about is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and specifically Title I of the ADA. There is some really good guidance, and I think this serves a great purpose for the employers and the employees. And so I'd recommend all of you go to eeoc.gov. This link to these resources will be out there, but they actually put together some resources on pandemics a while back and then have updated it. And there's the one thing I really like is they're trying to stay abreast of any changes with COVID in terms of symptoms and other things. And they're putting a date next to the questions and the responses so that you know how recent that might be. And that's really helpful because now as we're seeing children being impacted by COVID or different symptoms of COVID coming out, the more this is up to date, the more that employers and employees can utilize this to make sure that they're safe and working in safe environments. So a couple of the questions that I thought were really relevant from the guidance, and also that I know some of my partners were saying people want to know about, are first, how much information may an employer request from an employee who calls in sick? So again, during these times, if you called in sick before, might not have been any questions asked, but now during a pandemic, you may get asked other questions. And so the EEOC guidance is clear in saying that during a pandemic, ADA covered employers, which is 15 or more employees, may ask such employees if they're experiencing symptoms of the pandemic. And so for COVID, we've heard about these symptoms as fevers, chills, cough, shortness of breath, sore throat. Again, they have to keep that information confidential. So one of the concerns is if I answer those questions, what's going to be done with that information? And so that section of law hasn't changed either. Even if we're in a pandemic, the confidentiality of even if you have a positive diagnosis or you have these other symptoms or disclose other symptoms of COVID-19 should not be put on bulletin boards, should not be put out in emails, should not be shared far and wide. It needs to be kept confidential with the employer so that they can make the best decision for the agency or for the employer to say, yes, stay at home, or, you know, please come in. It sounds like you don't exhibit any of the symptoms. So that's I thought, a really relevant question. One of the things that at ACDL and other protection advocacy agencies across the country, one of the things we're asking is, should we take body temperatures? Well, obviously we just said a symptom of COVID-19 is fever. And so in the EEOC guidance, it says that you can, as an employer, take someone's body temperature or ask the COVID-related symptoms. Now, if it were me, and what I'm considering is more the COVID-related symptoms, because body temperature is just one of a list of symptoms and may not give you what you want, but the ADA does talk about this question and does say that employer can take a body temperature of someone. But again, if that's 100 or if that's 96, that information needs to be kept confidential. You shouldn't have a bulletin board or a score sheet saying, you know, here's JJ's temperatures for the week, and then, you know, right next to me is Natalie's temperatures. Again, that information needs to be kept confidential and should not be disclosed to anyone else.
JJ, we got a couple questions.
Sure.
One is, I'm going to go kind of big, wide to small. So the widest question is asking about the Emergency FLMLA Act, and it's asking, does it end at a certain time? Is it set to expire, or how does it work, and how long is it active for? Great.
No, that's a great question. Let me make sure I'm going to say this right. I believe, and I can follow up on this to make sure, I know for sure the Family First is only applicable from April 1st, 2020 to December 31st, 2020. Let me double check why. I'll take the next question on the Family First. But
okay. The next question is asking about parents who are paid to care for their children at home. And it's asking if those parents would be eligible for the pandemic unemployment assistance.
That's a question that I don't have an answer for. I would think so, and if any of my partners on the call know the answer to that question, but I thought there was some discussion about that, and so but I would open it up to the partners on the call
Okay.
if anyone does know that answer.
Natalie did share a link which might be related to that, but if anyone does raise their hand, I can unmute them. The third question is getting very narrow, and it's a question from Shelley, who says, I work in retail and use my hearing aids, but I've noticed that wearing masks affects that sound. I don't want the customers to feel uncomfortable with them. And there's not a question, but I believe the question is, do you have advice for how to handle that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and that was she must have access to the couple of questions down the road. So with the mask question, and this is what I'm hearing, is that it may be difficult to either hear someone if you're utilizing a mask because the mask may muffle someone's voice, and also for the hard of hearing community, I've heard that they utilize some lip reading to also understand what someone's saying. And so what I would suggest in both of those situations is for reasonable accommodation. So we have seen, I know media has put it out there, I've seen it on some Facebook posts and others, that there's been some masks that have been produced with a clear opening over the mouth so that to utilize lip reading is not impacted, but you're still, your face is covered. The other thing is to, think about the interactions in retail. If there are common things that you say to someone, say, hey, can I, not hey, you wouldn't say hey, but you would say, may I help you? And so maybe there's a note or a sign or something that does kind of say that, or, and then keep an appropriate distance. I mean, what we're getting and hearing from our healthcare officials are that not only the mask, but also the social distancing, the 6 feet are what are encouraged. So if there might be a time where you need to pull down your mask periodically, but stay that 6 feet away, that could be explained as well in case someone's having a difficult time hearing you. But if it's a need on your side to understand what that person is saying, then you may want to ask that your employer provide the clear mask so that the customers may be able to pick one up and engage in the communication with you, so you could help them in whatever you're selling.
Thanks, JJ. That's all the questions for now. Erica did add that people are working behind the scenes on that unemployment question. So we might have an answer today, or it'll come by email later.
Excellent. Thank you all for the help. Sitting here is kind of hard to search something, but I know we have a great team and most definitely will be responsive to that question because it's important. And I know we have a lot of family caregivers right now to make sure that they're surviving during this time. Most definitely having my son here at home, it most definitely comes with a challenge. And we just recently turned down his summer program because we are worried about infection and that impacting his disability. So we'll get you that answer. All right, so let's go into some more questions. Must you disclose to your employer that you have COVID? My short answer is yes. I mean, we're in a pandemic right now. If you did have COVID, that would be a direct threat to not only yourself, your own health, but to others. And so not disclosing obviously leads to everything that we've seen if you were to expose yourself, further getting sick, or others. Just know that an employer, and this hasn't changed, this is not a pandemic related. The ADA does and has permitted employers to make disability related inquiries. So they can't ask you those questions. They have to be job related, so they can't go through your whole medical history. But again, if it's specific and tailored to the COVID symptoms, my reading of the EEOC guidance is that's fair game. They can conduct medical exams if job related and consistent with business necessity. Now, I'm going to say a medical exam, and the EEOC guidance says this, is the temperature taking. I would not, at least my view as an attorney and as employee attorney, subject myself or my employees to blood draws or invasive exams that go well beyond symptoms of COVID. So again, if your employer is asking you to do a battery of tests that aren't related to the job and aren't consistent with the COVID symptoms, I would advocate for yourself and say, ask the question, why is this being done? How is this related to my job that I'm doing? And it, comment. If you feel that it's invasive, most definitely express to them that you feel that it's invasive. And then engage in the reasonable accommodation process if they explain themselves and you still need to do it. So again, inquiries and reliable medical exams must meet the standard and not be used to exclude employees. So if they're now screening for other issues and now they're starting to screen from other conditions or other disabilities, that's still prohibited. But again, we haven't at ACDL received an intake where someone's saying I was screened, like did a full medical exam, or I was asked to do a physical. But we have seen folks who have been asked questions and some who've had to had their temperature taken. So we go ahead.
Yeah, question about, it's from an employer. If we have employees who travel out of state, can we ask them to quarantine when they return?
So, I mean, first, as an employer, and the CEO of the agency, I would look at ways to not travel. Right now we're virtually participating in a training together. We virtually participate in a nationwide conference calls. And so first, as an employer, I would look at the need for travel. Is there a way to make that job task remote in terms of a virtual type device like we're using now? If a person does have to travel, you can lay out what they need to utilize, whether that be the mask and the appropriate social distancing, et cetera.
They clarified they're asking about personal travel too, like if they hear of an employee who traveled for personal reasons for that as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, again, I'm not in the business to give advice to employers, but what I would say is look at the EEOC guidance and see if there's a question related to that. I did not see one specific to that issue, but I think you would want to, what I've been doing is having frequent all staff meetings to talk about all of our safeties and what maintains that safety, and travel and being safe most definitely would be something that I would talk about. If you did know that someone traveled to I don't know, a hotspot, let's say, and I don't know, pick one. What we already know from the training today is that you could ask the questions related to COVID-like symptoms and do the temperature test and all those other things that EEOC has been clear that you can do. And then again, I believe they could work at that point, quarantine them for a certain period of time without any additional information, in my view, would be a little excessive. Other questions?
Not right now.
Okay. Great. So one of the things that I do want to talk about,
we do have actually someone with their hand raised who wants to verbally share. So I'm going to
Sure.
Unmute you now, Kathy, one of our most consistent attendees.
Great.
Hi, JJ. My daughter isn't with me today, but I told her we are going to talk about job stuff. And I said, do you have any questions? And she says, where's my paycheck? So a lot of us parents have young adults that work part-time or very part-time. And so she works for the university and not a lot of hours, maybe 10 hours a week. Would she be eligible for the, what was it called, the PUA?
You're talking for which law are we talking? Whether to say
well,
that again?
The reimbursement that they're, and I didn't write it down, but for people that can't work now because of their own medical issues with the COVID.
Yeah, so, and without knowing more, I'm not sure it applies in that situation, unless her hours have been drastically cut, but she's still employed. So that's what I'm hearing is she's still employed, but her hours have been cut to a point where she's not making what she used to. And so I'm not reading that law to apply to someone who's still working. I'm reading that law to apply to someone who's unemployed at this time. So what I would, again, knowing some of what some of the universities are doing, I know furloughing and cutting hours and all of those other things. The only thing I would say is to help your daughter advocate to see if others have also had their hours reduced. What we see, at least from phone calls sometimes, is they choose the person with the disability to cut their hours, and maybe others have not. So as long as it's kind of uniformly applied across the board, then there's not discrimination, at least. But also, just kind of checking in with the employer just to say, how's the reopening of the state going to impact her hours? What's in the horizons, just so that maybe you and your daughter can make the best decision for her if this is the employer she wants to stay with, or if she needed additional hours to maybe go back out looking for a job, which is difficult at this time. But again, my personal advice would be she's got a job, but try to advocate to get a few more hours during this time.
And just to be clear, the U of A is closed, but she will be home a long time with us because of her medical challenges she has. So it's kind of her and us choosing for her to not go back.
Okay. Yeah. No. I mean, if the decision is made, she's not going to go back to work, then I would
For
look
now.
at. Yeah. I would look at these other laws, and if it's because of exposure to COVID, then that's something to consider, and then see if these laws apply. But under the current circumstances, because she still's got a job, I'm not thinking that the laws we spoke about apply at this point.
Okay. Thank you, JJ.
Great. All right. So one of the things that I want to spend a little time on, and this is COVID related and beyond COVID, what I feel is the best tool under the ADA for people with disabilities to acquire jobs and to maintain their employment is the use of reasonable accommodations. And so we're going to see a lot of folks who are going to request accommodations during this time. There's going to be requests from the employers to wear masks, and can an employer ask that you wear a mask? And the short answer is yes. But there's always that at the end of a lawyer's statement. So make sure that if you are required to wear a mask, that you're able to. Whether that be due to a disability, an allergy, a need to be able to see one's lips, as we were talking about earlier. If your job requires you to wear gloves, what if you have a latex allergy? Again, those are simple accommodations, again, in my mind, that can be asked for in terms of non-latex gloves, modified face masks, so that folks can communicate, gowns that are designed for someone who may be in a wheelchair, if that's what's needed to be worn now. So again, self-advocacy tip 2, 3, 4, I don't know where we're at right now, is to utilize the reasonable accommodation provision of the law. That is your best tool. And again, in writing, you don't have to, in the law, use magic words, reasonable accommodations, but my advice to all of you is to say that this is a reasonable accommodation. Now, one of the questions in EEOC or that I've heard is, does an employer still have to engage in the interactive process or still consider someone's reasonable accommodation request during COVID? If it's similar, like maybe it's being provided due to COVID, can you still receive reasonable accommodations or go through the reasonable accommodation process? And the short answer that I saw or that I interpreted was yes. So don't let that stop you. For example, one of the big things that is happening right now is a lot of you who are working now might be teleworking. And so if you're teleworking, that can be a form of reasonable accommodation that could allow you to work from home safely with necessary accommodations. If that's something you need to extend beyond the reopening of the state, for example. So let me just give you something I recently heard was, with the governor's statement that we're reopening on Saturday, that the employer has told someone they have to be back in the office on Monday. Now, if that person has an underlying health condition or disability that is impacted by exposure to COVID, you need to ask for continued teleworking as soon as possible. And now is the opportune time to do that, especially if your employer is telling you next week or in 2 weeks, we're going to open, or even if they're telling you in a month, we're going to open. Just because we're going to open does not mean that maybe the employer's got the requisite PPE on site, or that others, you still might not be exposed. So again, please know that reasonable accommodations is something that you should be using now into the future. And a great resource for that is the Job Accommodation Network. The Job Accommodation Network created a resource page directly related to COVID, and they gave a long list of accommodation ideas. And just know accommodations are not limited to a list that appear on a website. It's directly related to your disability and directly related to the creativity between you and your employer. So I'm going to pause there because, again, sometimes accommodations lead to questions or people telling me my employer didn't do this or my employer did this. And so I open up to see if there's any comments or questions on maybe what employers are doing out there that are a great example, or what employees may be worried that they need that their employer has either told them in the past or they're telling them now is not going to be provided. So are there questions out there about reasonable accommodations?
We'll give folks a minute to add some questions about that. We received a private question a few minutes ago, and it's touching on something you said earlier. So if your employer has furloughed you and isn't asking everyone back to work after the furlough, this person has concerns that they would not invite back people with disabilities. And so I guess one unstated question is what would you do about that? And then their other question is more verging on advice, and it's asking if you think this is a good time to consider changing job paths, especially if you have had years of experience with that employer.
So to the first question, I mean, as an attorney, one of the questions that I ask when someone calls me with a situation like that, oh, well, I was laid off, and I think I was laid off because I'm a person with a disability. I ask the question, were others laid off? And if the answer is no, I was the only one, and then the next question is, how many years experience do you have? Okay, let's continue the hypo. I have 10 years. Did they retain people with less experience in the same position, same categories? If the answers keep being kind of yes and point towards it's because of a disability, then I would recommend that person go to the EEOC and file a disability discrimination complaint. If others were furloughed and then laid off, and there's no pattern, no reasoning there by protected class, whether that be disability or something else, then unfortunately I believe it could be an impact of the pandemic. I mean, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of businesses close. We're seeing people getting laid off because they can't support or continue to pay for them. That's why there's been this infusion of money towards small businesses and nonprofits to maintain payroll during this time so people aren't laid off. But the short answer is, if you think it's related to your disability, is to run yourself through those questions and examine maybe who else was laid off. And if you might be the only one, or it was every person with a disability, then it would be something that you would want to go to the EEOC with. And my view, and working in this field for 18 years, I do think there's going to be some cases where people are worried that people with disabilities are expendable and can be terminated during this time, but that's not the case. The law hasn't changed and your rights are the same. So please advocate and enforce your rights. The second, give me the second hypo. Should you change your careers? Well, I want to be a talk show host, and I don't know if there's ever a right time to take that leap. But again, personally, I would just say that finding employment is difficult. Right now, it is extremely difficult. And so if you're able to maintain employment, personally, I would advocate for maintaining employment as long as it's supportive and you're not putting yourself or your health at risk. Because again, jobs are hard to come by, period, for people with disabilities, but at this time, even harder. So if you can make it work and your employer is not going to lay you off, engage in that interactive process, get the reasonable accommodations you need, and keep working. And it doesn't hurt to look while you have a job as well. So, I mean, it's always better to have a job and look rather than not have a job and be out there in the job market. So appreciate those questions. Other things?
Yeah, a question about masks. Can adults with disabilities be required to wear masks at work if they can't remove them themselves?
That's a great question. I mean, the requirement can be there, but there has to be reasonable accommodations. So let's play that through. So if the person can't remove the mask, then what else can be done? So depending on the work environment, if you have a private office, you can utilize a closed door, limit telework. Obviously won't expose anyone to any except for at your house. So those are some quick, easy accommodations that I just came up with in my head. And so again, it can be a requirement. So the short answer is yes, an employer can make it a requirement. But if it's a person with a disability that cannot wear the mask for the factors that we've just said, or in the hypothetical that the person just put out there, then you ask for reasonable accommodations. And so that could be utilizing a safe workspace that you don't have interaction. So really the mask is to prevent that interaction in terms of the exposure between two. And so if you're in your private office and only conduct meetings virtually, something like this, that exposure is cut down, or continue teleworking is another option. But again, if someone utilizing a mask and can't put that on or off independently, again, is there assistance? But that's something that an employer have to, work through and talk to. And I would strongly encourage both the employee and employer to talk through that one, because it does not seem like it would be complicated. But I think some people get a little worried sometimes when they think this is a requirement. And the short answer is yes, it's a requirement, but yes, there are also reasonable accommodations.
So we have a question about travel from the beginning, but kind of from the other side of things.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, if an employee goes on personal travel and then they come back to work and the employer requests that the employee quarantine themselves, like, is that can employees be asked that? Do employees have to do that?
Again, it can be a requirement. I think depending on the quarantine, I think you have to take it case by case. So if I traveled, to Phoenix, let's say, I'm in Tucson right now, that's different than if I traveled to New York City. And so I think in both of those hypotheticals, I think the employer shouldn't have a one size fits all. And so I would think that the employee should explain where they went, the measures that they took, that they're not exhibiting symptoms. And then if there is any prescribed amount of quarantine, that be limited instead of anything excessive. But again, if the employer is telling you quarantine and you can telework and you still have a job and just do it for 2 weeks, again, I would stick with your job and take that, rather than falling on the sword of, no, I want to be in the office tomorrow. If you still have a job and the requirement is that you telework for 2 weeks, and then go back in. So, I think the answer's in there that you can make a requirement, but I would not make it excessive. I would also look at a case by case, because a uniform blanket of saying you can't travel, or if you travel, you have to quarantine for 14 days. That can be excessive if someone just traveled from one city to the other within 2 safe areas, or where there was 1 COVID case and no COVID cases where they went. So, I think that we should examine it on a case by case.
I don't see any more questions in the chat right now, but I'll keep an eye on it. A reminder, if you're wanting to share a question verbally, you can click the participants button, and then at the bottom, there's a raise hand button. If you're joining by the phone, you can dial *9 and your number will pop up to the top of our screen for us to unmute you.
So let me take there was a question that someone had, and it was different than requiring to wear a mask. It was the required not to wear a mask. And so again, the employer can make that a request, but if there's an accommodation need to wear the mask, which could be exposure to COVID and maybe underlying health conditions or disability, then most definitely, again, utilize that self-advocacy and ask for the accommodation. But I would have to, and maybe the retail example is one where you shouldn't wear a mask because you have to communicate, but you can still hear someone. And if you have to repeat yourself a few times, I would much rather, as an employer, want my staff to wear masks than not. Now, anecdotally, and I did hear that there are some industries where they're not wearing a mask or they're not required to. Now that's a choice they can make, but I think in an employment context, you as an employee should most definitely make that a request, that if you want to wear a mask in this situation, in this question, make that request. One of the things that I saw in the EEOC guidance that I thought was really nice that they included in there is a discussion about flexibility. And so they said flexibility by employers and employees is important in determining if some accommodation is possible in the circumstances. So again, we're in different times, but even this flexibility extends post-COVID, but even more so now. So temporary job restructuring of marginal job duties. So every job has essential job functions. So there are things that you have to do every day, but a marginal job duty, if that can be temporarily halted or stopped or done in a different manner. So for example, we have folks in both our Phoenix and Tucson office that get the mail. And that's something that's done every single day. But during this time, it's not a requirement that it be done every day. We've put messages out there that there will be some delays due to COVID, and that's just the reality. Another example is temporary transfer to a different position. Maybe someone has a disability that, again, is going to be impacted by exposure to COVID and COVID-like symptoms. Can they be transferred to a different position as a temporary transfer? And then when this hopefully all goes away, they be transferred to their other position. Again, that's an accommodation that existed pre-COVID, but these are things that we need to think about even more now. Modifying work schedules. So is there a way to modify your work schedule on doing certain tasks in the morning versus the evening? Shift assignment change, how to perform things more safely during this time to reduce exposure. So commuting, I think that's one of the things we're seeing in some of the bigger cities is the commute has impacted people's exposure and also their ability to get to and from their job. And so I think looking at that commute and recognizing that there are accommodations that an employer could provide and the employee could suggest and engage in what I keep saying is the interactive process.
So we have a private comment that's echoing something you said. This person's from the hard of hearing community, and they suggest that if someone using scratch paper as a way to communicate, if the masks make it difficult because of that. And they say that they often tell customers that their ears went out of business, and most of the people understand and are very helpful then. There was a question about stores requiring customers to wear masks or requiring customers to take temperatures. Is that something stores can do?
So let me talk about the scratch paper real quick. One of the other things that I'll suggest, and just to disclose that the nature of my son's disability impacts his ability to use his voice. So he uses a AUGCOM communication device. Prior to using an AUGCOM device, he used low-tech communication tools, which would be picture cards with words on them or pictures describing what he wanted to do. And so if in the nature of your job, you are frequently saying certain things like the joke that the person just said, you could put that on a laminated card and keep that, and it immediately introduces you to the person, immediately engages them on the way that you all need to communicate, and it leads to good relations and good customer service. And most of the time I've seen really good positive feedback from individuals when they understand this is the form of communication we're going to use. So on the can stores, well, we're not talking about that today, but it's a big question, and I know that it's starting to be implemented. Again, the short answer is probably yes, and so long as it's not excluding folks with disabilities. Now, an assumption that maybe a person with disability has it versus someone else, but they don't have any of the temperature setting symptoms, or they answer the questions and they don't have any symptoms, but they're still excluded because we're at an at-risk community, that would be discrimination. But I have heard and have seen that businesses are implementing kind of a temperature type screen. Now, when you do those type of things, it sometimes can be lead to abuse, and we don't want that to be. We don't want that to happen. But I think the short answer is probably yes. But I think more and more is going to come out, and some guidance might come out from hopefully the Department of Justice on the rights of people with disabilities in accessing private businesses during this time, and to make sure that they're not disproportionately impacted or excluded.
I don't see any more questions. I just want to prompt the audience to, if people do have stories to share about conversations you've had with your employers about teleworking, that, I'm sure this group would love to hear a little bit about that experience. Or even if people have continued working in changed ways, like, are people willing to share how that's been for them? These are all, we have a great expert here we're asking questions to, but I just want to reemphasize that this can be a time to kind of share with each other as well what this community has been experiencing.
So I'm just going to wrap up and then let hopefully folks do participate in that. I would be interested in hearing what's going on out there. If anybody has any tips or great outcomes of what's going on. I have seen some amazing employers during this time and being flexible for all their staff to deal with what's new to all of us. I don't think any of us from anyone has dealt with this. I don't think anybody was around when the Spanish flu was there, in a very different world than we are in now. So the last thing that I'll say is I've heard about delays in unemployment. The best advice is just to keep calling, applying, contacting, documenting all your contacts. If there are delays in checks, I've seen reports of that some folks did not get their additional $600 check, but DES had said that those are going out now. Keep a record during this time. We are losing track of days and who we spoke with or where we heard something. So keeping a log of that is very important. So if you are seeking unemployment during this time and that's been delayed, it's not unique, but unfortunately the best advice I have is to keep pursuing and keeping a track record. And if there's any remedy down the road for a delay, then maybe you would be compensated. Now, I'm not saying there is going to be. I'm just saying that it's always good to keep a good track record in case someone says, no, we didn't get your email or we didn't get your phone call. At least your log will show that you did make a contact. One of the other agencies, we have some school officials and also some vocational rehabilitation counselors or administrators on the phone. We have heard in other states and even in Arizona of some of the transition related services being impacted in schools, and then also with Voc Rehab. There's a recent memo that just came out, I think today, from Rehabilitation Service Administration that we'll put out either in the chat or through email with some questions and answers on Voc Rehab's responsibilities during this time, which the short description is they are still open, and maybe Chris Mackey's out on the audience, but what I read is, you're still open, you're still providing services, you're just doing it at a different format as a quick summary. Now it goes into some specific questions on signing, signing documents or signing the IPE and other things, but essentially I read, provide reasonable accommodations, you're still to adhere to the deadlines. That's what I read. But I would most definitely, if Kristen Mackey wants to speak on Arizona RSA and what they're doing during this time, I think they're a great resource to help pursue employment and maintain your employment. And they can be great advocates too in this reasonable accommodation process. We've seen some really great VR counselors advocate in the interactive process on behalf of their clients, which has led to gaining employment or maintaining employment. So I'll close with that and most definitely want to answer questions if folks still have them.
One question came in, it's a private question. If a hard of hearing person uses a device/app like Google Translate, and this requires them to be within 1 foot from the other person, do you have any idea how that might work in an age of social distancing?
Yeah, I mean, not being familiar enough with the technology, because I was thinking, could the two devices be linked to one another? So that if the one person who's hard of hearing is using the Google Translate, could that be linked or paired with another device that the person who is 6 feet away also has? I don't know that, but I could imagine knowing, when you do AirDrop and other things like that, you can be 6 feet away and still drop information to another person. So because I'm not a techie, I don't know the answer, but I would think that there are some technologies out there that would allow for that transition. Now I see Michelle Michaels, who's my guru, no devices cannot be linked. So what I would utilize then is probably some other form of communication, and I don't know what that might be in terms of technology, or again, using instant messaging or text messages might be another way to keep distance but still communicate from a distance. I'm back here. I can see this
Sure.
now.
Just
So
if you could read the question out loud so people on the phone could hear it.
most definitely. So Yvonne asked, with the reopening of workplaces, keeping the 6-foot distance would be very difficult. Has that changed for reopening, or will it be soon? Working with people with disabilities, it would be a challenge. Your thoughts? So the 6-foot, from my understanding, is a continued recommendation, even with the reopening. And so, yeah, keeping that distance, it would be a challenge. And so one of the practical ways is that for most parts of the day, let's say in our office environment, I'm going to, as we roll out the reopening in the next 30, 45 days, asking people to be in their offices. And if they do have to meet with somebody, to maintain that 6 feet of distance and with a mask. If not, to use forms of communication like instant messaging. We utilize Teams to do that. And then have some virtual meetings through video chats so that can. Now, working with people with disabilities, if you are a direct care service provider, obviously you have to be next to that person. Now, there are exceptions there where you're going to still, in my opinion, utilize that mask. You're going to wash your hands. You're going to do all of those healthcare measures, and most definitely, those are different protocols that I would look more to the healthcare industry and the healthcare settings and what they're suggesting to make sure that you are as healthy as possible.
There's a question here, and it's getting back to a topic I think we covered last week. The question is, I got a call from a family that their son received a $2,100 check from AZDES, the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance. Do you know if they need to report it to SSI? He's disabled and working part-time and applied for unemployment benefits.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I can share just what people said last week to summarize, which
yes,
is
please.
that, Nicholas Love and an attorney from Tucson were sharing that at least for the first 12 months, these money coming into families would not be something that would be counted against their benefits, but after 12 months, it could become problematic. And the advice, which everyone said many times last week, was to look into an AZ Able account. So maybe that can be shared in the chat if someone has a link to that page. All the answers are on that page. And that is the safest and smartest way to handle that money, according to the experts that spoke last week. But that's just stuff that I learned personally last week. So I don't know if other people on the call have other things they want to add.
I wouldn't add anything to that, and that those who were on the call last week are experts in that area, and so I would defer to them in terms of benefits and the impact. These are different times, most definitely, and I just see that Sarah Roof did a link to the Arizona Able account, so that is a nice way to save money for a person with a disability that won't impact their Social Security. So if that need, the other thing to explore is if there are particular needs for that individual immediately with that additional money, that could be something, but again, to document that expenditure just in case there's ever questions of what did you spend the money, especially if you're a representative payee for that individual. Other questions out there, comments? And if not, then I know I'm right at the time where we want to open it up just to what else is going on, but let me see. Yvonne wanted to clarify about the question about the 6-foot rule. We are a day program for people with cognitive disabilities. So Yvonne, what I would suggest, obviously, is to talk with your employer, or if you are the director, is to implement all the appropriate measures that are being discussed in terms of PPE. So PPE is mask, the appropriate mask, and if you are in direct contact with someone within the 6 feet, you might want more like an N95 mask as opposed to maybe just a cloth mask. Make sure you have adequate supplies in terms of gloves, hand sanitizer, those type of items, disinfectant, especially if you're providing services and people are at tables or those kind of things. So most definitely different setting, employment setting, but all those measures should be explored. My opinion is to make sure those are implemented. What I've heard, I saw somewhere out in the community, it might have been Gompers talking about they made a purchase of masks, but those masks were only going to probably last them for a certain period of time. So I know everybody right now is buying masks. I'm looking at buying masks for my staff. So I would continue to purchase those, make sure there's enough, not only for you as the staff of the day program, but also for those participants to make sure both sides are safe. So again, thank you for clarifying that. But I do think that the 6-foot rule in that situation, again, you have to work within that space. So then you need to take those appropriate safety measures to work within the 6 feet. I see a comment from Vance Phillips, who says Arizona Able is a great resource. Daughter has been enrolled and she's a DDD member. Previously, we had a trust account for her. He highly recommends it for parents of children with disabilities.
So I know that on that opening poll, 82% are on the somewhat or very anxious scale of things. Do people want to share some of the things that are making them anxious? There's a lot of people on this call that might be able to share resources or ideas on how to manage or handle that anxiety. So I just want to kind of open that up as another topic if people want to raise their hand and share by clicking the raise hand button or dialing *9 on the phone, or keep typing in the chat. JJ, if I've had a conversation with my employer about reasonable accommodations previously,
Right.
and would that affect at all going back to have a new conversation or a new request or anything like that?
No, so if I'm hearing you right, if you had the conversation prior to kind of the
So
current
let's say
situation.
a year ago before COVID, I requested a reasonable accommodation and went through that whole process and it was granted and I'm still working for that employer. Can I go back and change my accommodation request now that COVID has changed the whole situation and the whole world?
So great question. So reasonable accommodations can be asked at any point. A person with a disability, even if they get certain accommodations, let's say from a year ago, but now a year later need additional accommodations, will that be related to COVID or not? You can ask, and there's no reason unless there's a defense that the employer can raise to provide those accommodations. Now, COVID has opened up maybe other needs for reasonable accommodations. For example, a person with a disability may have been able to work in the office without maybe certain technology to allow them to do the job, but now COVID and the potential exposure to COVID requires them to telework. So even if they were getting accommodations a year ago or for the past year in one form, that can now switch to telework or other accommodations. So short answer is yes, you can ask again, even if you're not fully back at work. I would, again, maybe, I don't know, this is the last tip, but if you are being asked to go back to work, is to pause and think about what that's going to look like and how that may impact your disability, what accommodations you might need, and engage in that process prior to you stepping foot into the office or wherever you might work, if that's your situation. If you're currently working right now and you are now seeing you may need additional accommodations, schedule that meeting, send that email, follow whatever steps your employer requires. But I would do that. I do see now that things are opening. That may raise people's anxiety. That also may raise exposure. So if you need additional accommodation, please ask.
So someone on the phone has their hand raised. So I'm going to unmute you now, Marianne, and then you'll be able to share your question or comment. You should be unmuted now.
Yeah, thanks. Yesterday I got an email, probably a lot of people did, saying that the public libraries are going to be opening, and one of the guidelines that they have stated in the email is that all people going into the public library will need to wear a mask. So we've talked a lot about a mask, and I don't know if you have answered this, and if you have, I apologize, but my daughter, she's 18, she has significant disabilities, intellectually compromised quite a bit, and she is very afraid of masks, probably given all the medical appointments and things she's had surrounding people wearing masks. If she will not wear a mask, like just will not wear a mask, but the requirement of the public library or Costco is that a person has to wear a mask to enter their facility, will she just be excluded from society for the duration of the pandemic?
So that's a great question. And thinking through everything that you just said, a couple ideas, and again, I don't know if this helps. And so having a son, as I shared before, who'd been exposed to medical folks like you're describing, going or being around the hospital is not a great experience for him, or hearing fire engine noises, those kind of things. So what we've done is try to explain prior to entering those situations, the best we can, whether that be through stories, whether that be through showing him pictures, those kind of things. So this is just personal advice of just what I've done is trying to, we've read stories about coronavirus. We've read, his therapists have worked with him on even incorporating into speech lessons about feelings and maybe how he's feeling during this time. So if there's any way, that she might be exposed to mask in a different way, I've seen a lot of great masks. I purchased some Bob's Burgers masks for my son because they're kind of funny. So they don't look like surgical masks. They just have funny things on them that maybe something that she likes, that, you get your own mask. Now, my son doesn't like things on his face. He doesn't like to wear hats a long time. So what we've tried to do is tell him, try it on, just try to expose and trying to just build up to longer periods of time. Now, practically, legally, your daughter needs a reasonable accommodation to access the library. So I would make a phone call to the library and say, what reasonable accommodations do you have in place for people with disabilities that cannot wear masks? So that's somebody who may have to wear an oxygen mask the whole time, or that could be your daughter's situation, or that could be someone who, needs a different form or just can't wear it due to a disability because they can't breathe with a mask on. And so what I've seen prior to the mask requirement is stores have been opening at different times, allowing, folks elderly or with disabilities certain windows of time. And so that existed prior to COVID. And so, but now I think in other settings like the library, you're going to have to say, can my daughter go in, 30 minutes before it opens, and then we could get our books and then go to the reading room or the study rooms they have, or some type of where you still can access the services, but it just may have to be done at a different time or in a different manner. Or if you all agree to maintain the 6 feet of space after explaining your daughters, I would try that. And if that doesn't work and they're saying absolutely no, call us back, and I'd be interested in working through that one with you and some more specifics.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
No problem.
So we have some folks in the chat sharing some of their anxieties. People are anxious about other people not using PPE or not following the social distancing rules. There's some anxieties about programming for persons with disabilities who cannot be consistent in keeping their masks on. So that's been a kind of theme today. And then there's concerns about all this great additional funding that's happening right now to help support people and places with COVID, and that funding going away, but the need not going away.
Right. Yeah. So on the first comment, I mean, I know people with disabilities, certain people may have challenges in maintaining keeping the mask on. But again, I think it takes all of us as a disability community to educate one another, to work with the individuals to understand why. I think sometimes, again, I'll just speak as a father. Sometimes I think, just kind of forcing it upon my son leads to resistance. But if I explain and show others are doing it, and this is why, and this is, we'll get to go to Target again if you get to wear the mask. It has to be an education process instead of just like, they'll never do it or they don't know how to do it. This is the new world, and I think folks are going to be required or asked to wear masks for a period of time, and so we can't just exclude folks just based on, I don't think they can, or they don't understand, or they'll never do it. There can be attempts, and then even if those attempts are not successful, you still have to explore ways to deliver that service through a different means, even if it's not face-to-face or in person. So I don't want this to lead to further exclusion of people with disabilities, which has historically happened. And I do think that could be a result of this. Now, in terms of funding and resources, all I can say is you all saw another package come out. I think the ARC put out the latest information on another funding package that does have some disability-related funding. You all are the voice out there. The best thing to do is to contact your legislator and inform them that you, your child, the community needs these additional resources because we are the community that's impacted. So all of you, appreciate everyone who came on today, and even if all of you just made that phone call or shot an email, that would make a difference. I know that some people say, oh, they're not going to listen to me. But if you're a direct constituent of someone in that district, if, you know, let's say for me, I contact Ann Kirkpatrick and I show that I'm from her district, that's going to make a difference. So, you know, again, share what stories are coming out of their district, and they may listen to you and gather other parents. One of the most impressive is the parent movement. And so if your parents out there, you have a network already that I know you have at your disposal, whether that be through a text tree, through a phone tree or email or Facebook group, utilize those and get the message out there. So I think you're rightfully concerned that, you know, the money may not be there for a long time, but again, the voice of the people have to be heard. So I would encourage you all to get out there.
So we have just a couple more minutes here. So I want to encourage, especially those that are slower processors that maybe need a little bit more time, to ask their questions or share their comments here in the last couple minutes. So here's a comment about a day program. So they found at their day program that when members attempt to wear masks, they have their hands up around their face far more than usual. There are other problems as well. This person's observation is just that sometimes wearing a mask is more trouble than it's worth.
Again, all I would say is to keep yourself safe and the individuals and the members safe. If there are measures and ways to deliver service in a safe manner, implement all of those. You know, again, a mask is one of many. And so I know we focus a lot on masks today, and I know there's some links to CDC guidance on masks. I would refer you all, they're the experts, the medical on the use of masks. But again, keeping yourself safe, the community safe, individuals safe. So if a mask cannot be worn or there's resistance or other touching of the face as a result of the mask, do everything else. You know, do not just stop and say, oh, we failed because they couldn't wear a mask. Explore all the alternatives, implement all the safety measures that are being recommended. I just don't want things just to stop altogether and someone not to get access to a service because they can't wear a mask. So again, I really appreciated the time that you've given me. Keep coming back. This is only week 8. I don't know how many weeks this is going to go, but we're going to be here for you. So I've really appreciated the time, and I encourage all of you to stay safe and well, and keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you, JJ. I think you got some love in the chat already, and I think it's gonna come faster. Some people really appreciate sharing some of your personal stories and combining that with your legal expertise, and I guess your expertise as being an employer too. To kind of close out today and to share some important information, we're gonna send this over to a member of your staff, Natalie, who is gonna kind of close us and give us some more information.
Hey. Hi, everybody. If you haven't, some of you know me by now, but if you don't, my name is Natalie Luna Rose. I'm the Communications and Outreach Manager for the Arizona Center for Disability Law, and I have the privilege to work with JJ and all our wonderful attorneys and advocates who do great work and have been during this whole situation. So I'm just a lowly PR hack, so I admire their work and all the work that they do, and our partners as well. So thank you to them as well. But we did mention at the beginning that we do have a survey, and I will have the survey in the chat box in the moment, or unless somebody wants to throw that up there, John or Nicholas.
Just got added.
Thank you, sir. The survey, the coronavirus has created big changes, as we've been talking about, to our daily routines. Life, has kind of been turned upside down. How does it get turned right back side up? A lot of you, talked about, what does that look like coming back to the workplace, going back out into the real world, so to speak. So we're going to take your, for lack of a better word, temperature. So this survey is intended for individuals with disabilities who require supports, their family members, and workers of non-governmental organizations to provide direct services to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So it's a 5-minute survey. I think it's a good survey. The ADDN team worked hard on it, and I think it's fairly comprehensive. If you do feel like maybe we didn't answer a question or ask a question, please let us know. It's a quick 5-minute survey, and the survey will be open until Monday. So with that, if we have any more questions, I think we've got just like 5 more minutes before, if not, we can wrap it up. But if there's any more questions, please either raise your hand and Nicholas will let you in or answer you, or you can put something in the chat. Oh yes, thank you, Sarah. We will be announcing the results of the survey next week and use the results to share with our state leaders. All right, barring, is there a description of the survey? Yes, when the link, if you click on it, I read some of the instructions. So yes, it'll be on, it's on there.
And I believe we're going to put the survey out on our listservs as well. Is that happening? Or I don't know.
Yes.
Yes. So if you see that coming later and you know someone who the survey will be targeted at that's not on this call today, please pass that information along and share it with your constituents.
Okay, well, barring any more questions, I want to again thank you for your time this afternoon. And I think this was, again, another really great session, great questions. Thanks, everyone. And again, be safe, and we'll get back to you soon about next week's call.